Hey there, this video is going to help you fill out your cell structures worksheet. So make sure you have that with you and a pen or pencil before you begin. So when you're ready, we're first going to start talking about structures that are in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Number one is the cell membrane. Probably the most important part of the cell because that's the outer boundary of the cell, kind of like the skin that holds all the stuff inside. It also is really important because it controls what moves into and out of the cell. So its job is maintaining homeostasis. Remember, the cell wants to maintain a stable internal environment. And the cell membrane is how that happens, so it can decide what it needs to come in and what it needs to get out. Now, the shape of this is, it's called a lipid bilayer, bi meaning two, so two layers of lipids. So if you look at the structure in the bottom left, it's got these heads that have a phosphate group attached, and that's got a little bit of a negative charge on it. And then the glycerol backbone, remember we talked about that in our macromolecule projects, and these long fatty acid tails. So these are made of carbon and hydrogen. They're not polar or charged at all. So they are hydrophobic, meaning water-fearing. They do not get along with water. Remember, water has a positive end and the hydrogens are a little bit negative. So that's called polar or a little bit charged. So they get along really well with this phosphate head that's a little bit charged as well. So the head is hydrophilic or water-loving. And that's what causes this to happen. So these tails all end up stuck together in the middle, keeping water out. And then the heads are on the top and the bottom where they're interacting with watery stuff on the outside and the inside of the cell. So this double lipid layer makes a nice barrier that prevents a lot of things from getting in and out. The only thing that can really go through here are small, non-charged molecules. They can kind of dissolve into the lipids there and make their way through. But something that's charged like water or bigger molecules, they can't get through. But now you're saying, wait a minute, cells have to have water in them, right? And yes, that's true. So they have special channels. So see these blue things in here? These are proteins stuck in the lipid membrane. And some of them are special channels for allowing certain things to go through. So an example of that would be one called an aquaporin, which lets water in and out. Our next structure is the cell wall. And this isn't in all cells, but it's found in both cell types, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So some bacteria have them, and then plants, algae, and fungi, which are all eukaryotes, have them as well. Now notice animal cells do not have cell walls, and that allows them to move around a lot more. So cell wall goes on the outside of the cell membrane. Here's the cell membrane and then the cell wall. And this, like I said, gives shape and protection to some of the cells. And it's made up of polysaccharides. So remember, a polymer is lots of little monomers stuck together. So this is a polymer of carbohydrates. So these long chains of tough, rigid carbohydrates that form this tough shell on the outside of the cell. In plants, a lot of times it's cellulose, and in fungi it's chitin. So it's just two examples of the materials that are in here. But they're kind of folded together like a basket, protecting the cell. Now this stuff is just some sticky stuff that helps hold two cells together. Next up is the cytoplasm. That's the watery cell goo that's in the middle of the cell. It holds everything inside the cell. It's made of 80% water, so mostly water with some dissolved stuff in it. And so this fills the cell, and it also allows things to move around. That's kind of an important thing. If the cell was just dry inside, nothing would be able to move around in it. But being water, things can just kind of float or swim around in it. The cytoskeleton is kind of like our skeleton. It gives shape on the inside of the cell. So just like our bones are on the inside of our bodies, and they hold our bodies up and give us the shape we need to move around so we're not just puddles of goo floating on the floor. The cytoskeleton gives shape and support from the inside of the cell. It also aids in transportation. Now, these are long proteins that kind of are like little fibers that go across the cell. And so not only are they holding the shape of the cell, but they're like highways for transporting things. So there's special proteins. Here's my cytoskeleton. There's little proteins that can kind of move along those protein fibers and take things from one end of the cell to the other, which is really important in long cells where you can't just expect something to dissolve its way over. Ribosomes, this is the last thing that's in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes that we're going to talk about today. So make sure both of those boxes are checked off so far on the things we've talked about. So these guys build proteins. They use instructions from the DNA to put proteins together. Now remember, a protein is a polymer of amino acids. So there are all these little amino acids stuck together in a long chain, and those are put together by ribosomes. Now these are made up of proteins themselves, along with some special RNA called ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. So that's what makes them up, and they can just be found floating around in the cytoplasm in all cells, because all cells need proteins. So moving on, take a minute to stretch or stand up if you need to, and then we're going to move into organelles, which are structures that perform specific functions in eukaryotic cells. First is the nucleus, and remember this is what defines a eukaryotic cell. It has to have a nucleus. So here's where the DNA is. In a prokaryote, the DNA is just kind of floating around in the cytoplasm, but here it's all bundled up and it's stuck inside a nice membrane. Oops, go back. So this has actually a double membrane with pores in it. Pore is just like a hole that allows messages to go in and out of the nucleus. So here in the nucleus, the DNA is controlling the whole cell. Kind of like the office at our school, right? That's where all the messages are sent to and from places. All the decisions are made for controlling the rest of the cell. Here's our endoplasmic reticulum, which is a fun word to say, or you can also just abbreviate it and say ER. So this is like a big factory for producing and transporting a couple different things. First, in the rough ER, that's this part with all the polka dots. These polka dots are actually ribosomes. So ribosomes will come and attach themselves to the rough ER when they're making a protein that needs to be stuck in the membrane. Remember those channels that we talked about, those proteins that are stuck in the cell membrane? There's a lot of those, so when one of those needs to be made, it gets made here in the rough ER, and then it gets processed and transported to where it needs to go. Then in the smooth ER, that's this part over here without any ribosomes on it, this part produces lipids. Remember that lipids are what makes up all of the membranes, so that's pretty important. So it also makes lipids and sends them to where they need to go. So the ER altogether is in charge of producing and transporting proteins and lipids. Chloroplasts are pretty cool little things, but they're not in all eukaryotes, only in the ones that do photosynthesis. So who's that? Plants and algae. So these guys are these nice green sort of lima bean shapes. They capture the sun's energy and turn it into carbohydrates, remember, like sugars. And that sugar is a way of storing chemical energy in the cell. So these guys are full of membranes. They actually have an inner and outer layer of membrane and lots of these little stacks. Kind of looks like cookies on top of each other. And they have lots of specialized proteins in there as well. And they also have their own DNA. So these guys are pretty independent. they can make copies of themselves and do their own thing in the cell. And that's pretty similar to our next one, also mitochondria. So these guys kind of look like a kidney bean, also full of membranes with lots of specialized proteins. And what these do is they convert the chemical energy from food, from sugars, into ATP. ATP is a little molecule that the cells use for their energy. So the cells can't directly use the energy that's stored in sugar. They have to break it down into ATP. So that's why these are found in all eukaryotes, even plants. So plants have their chloroplasts that make the food energy for them, turn it into carbohydrates, but they also need a mitochondria to break those carbohydrates down into ATP, which they can use. So these guys also have a double membrane and their own DNA, so they also can make copies of themselves on their own, pretty independent of the nucleus. All right, so by now you should have all the parts of your cell structures worksheet filled out. Definitely go back and rewind to parts that you might have missed so you get everything filled in. And once you're done with that, you're going to move on to the next assignment. So for that, you're going to grab the Cells R Us job application. You're going to pick one of those cell structures that we just talked about, and you're going to pretend to be that structure and fill out a job application to try to get hired by Cells R Us. So to apply, complete the job application. Be sure to attach a recent selfie of yourself or draw a picture. Fill out the application. Tell me what your cell structure is good at doing and maybe what other parts of the cell it works well with. Be a little creative here. And then turn your Cells R Us job application into the basket along with your cell structures worksheet, and you'll be good to go. Have a good day.